Into that one. Okay, we're going to recap this thing right here. What we got is what we had the Mustang come in with the misfire code. Wasn't running bad. Test drive didn't produce any results of any kind, so the scan tool showed a P0302. Now, what does a P0302 mean? A misfire on cylinder number 2. Basically, what is a misfire at its root? We've got a cylinder that's supposed to be carrying its share of the load, of the collective load, and for some reason or another it is not producing as much power as the other cylinders, and so if the crankshaft slows down at that particular place, then you're going to wind up seeing the computer is going to pick up on the fact that it's slowed down. It's actually got Chrysler calls this an adaptive numerator, and basically it's looking at the we're measuring this stuff in nanoseconds anyway, but it's basically looking at the little windows on the crank sensor, and it basically is measuring those things really tight with a really tight tolerance. It knows what the engine RPM is. It knows how fast those things ought to be going by in relation to one another. If it's got a misfire on, say, cylinder number 2, then whenever it comes to that particular place in the crankshaft travel, then you're going to see those little, if it's got little square waves for your windows like this, you know, wow, that doesn't write at all. I don't know what I'm even doing with that up here. If it's got little square waves and they're farther apart, you know, the little set of square waves is farther apart, I don't know where number 2 is firing. Your cam sensor's figured in here too, because it helps it determine which cylinder is on compression, which on exhaust. Anyway, it's basically it sees those spread out a little bit, and then it tosses that 302 if it's that. Now, be careful with your misfire codes, because on some vehicles, a misfire code, it'll throw you a misfire code for 2, and it'll actually be misfiring on 5. You know, which is weird. I don't know why it does that, but occasionally you'll be busting your fanny looking at 2, but you need to have all of them. Anytime you got a misfire, it's always a good idea to look at all the plugs. I start with the one that's misfiring. If I see anything that's in my face there, if I don't see anything there, I'm going to look somewhere else. If I see a misfire, I'm going to take a spark plug and I'm going to measure the center electrode resistance. It ought to be about less than 8,000 ohms according to Ford. Champion spark plug does not like you measuring those, because theirs are all over the place. I don't know why that is, but I mean, I was at Ford Motor Company Advanced Engine Performance Training. One of the things that they showed was a little, I mean, when I was going through one of the little training modules on the computer, where they showed measuring the resistance of the center electrode on the spark plug. And I started doing that before I saw it on there, because I was just curious as to what it would be. And then I started seeing correlations between a misfire, like if a spark plug was wide open, it didn't have any continuity there at all. That's a problem. If it's got too little resistance, that's a problem too. You see, so long and short of it is the P0302 is gathered by the crankshaft has learned, I mean, when you let off the gas and you're coasting, it looks at that nice even pattern when you're coasting, is whenever nothing's going on to cause it to change. Then it picks that up as the norm, and it compares what it's getting to that norm, and if it gets slightly out, if it's out of line, you know, imagine Iron Man looking at his heads-up display and something's not right, he's going to be able to flag that. That's how sharp those things are. So he didn't find anything at all the way it ran wrong, but it would re-illuminate after a couple of days. In other words, the guy would come back, he said, hey, my check engine light came back on, got the same daggum code. And so he put the power balance up there, which basically gives you a picture of if it's got a nice even running engine, it's going to look like that. You may see a little bit of moving up and down from one cylinder to the other, but if you got one that drops out, it makes a shadow track that's a little bit lower consistently than the rest of them. That's what he found on number 2. It's numbered up here, and according to the firing order. I can show you that on that little MaxiDOS thing I got. Will do that. It'll actually put a power balance screen up there on the Ford stuff. Nobody else does that I know of except Ford, but anyway, it works real slick when you're trying to find a misfire. That particular one showed a 40 RPM drop, so compression was 40 pounds low too. It was 40 and 40, you know. And so here you wind up going to the engine guy, because the drivability guy had got to the point where he figured it was an engine problem. That's when he found this bent rod. You know, what can bend a rod without piston damage? Yeah, if you get water in there. So how are you going to get water in there? If there's nothing wrong with the coolant system, you don't have a blown head gasket or anything, how's water going to go in there?
No seals that have been damaged? Oh. if the rain gaps are turned the same way?
Well, that won't make water go in there. That'll actually cause compression loss. But why? No. What if you drive it into the drink? Into the water. You ingest water driving down the road. It might be a deep puddle.
Where's it ingesting water at?
Through the air intake. You'd be surprised what can get past that air filter when it goes in there. But somehow or another, you got water in there apparently, and it was just enough to where it bent that rod, and then it managed to spit the water out. You see, because that hydraulic lock's going to happen. I actually had one time. I had a leak in fuel pressure regulator on it, and when I went to fire it up, it had trickled enough gas in there to where it hydraulic locked and I've seen that more than once. It hydraulic locked the pistons with gasoline, and that one was damaged, but it was a fuel pressure regulator. The little diaphragm in it ruptured, and the vacuum line carried fuel into the intake, and it went down in there, and it hydraulic locked it like that. And Philip Kirkland had one like that on a Jeep, the straight six Jeep, and he actually was going to just take all the spark plugs out and spin it over and let it just blow the gas out of there, which is what you do. But before that, you disable the ignition system, right? Because you don't want this gas blowing out there with sparks happening. But he unplugged the distributor, but that's just the cam sensor. The crank sensor is back here in the bell housing. He didn't think about that. So when he spun it over, he still had sparks, and he also had gas going everywhere. And that Jeep looked like an anti-aircraft gun sitting out there blowing them balls of fire up into the sky. Of course, he didn't do any damage, but it's scary. All right, so right here, this number 2 piston. Let me ask you this, and I mentioned this to you yesterday, Willie. Whenever you pull a cylinder head off, if you've had one that's been ingesting a lot of water, what does that piston look like?
It's going to look like it's new, basically.
Yeah, it's actually going to steam all that carbon off of there, and that's why sometimes you'll see people, when they got a lot of carbon on top of the pistons, you can get so much carbon on top of the pistons in an engine to where it will actually begin to ping and labor knock, because it raises the compression. That carbon takes up some of the pressure, room in the combustion chamber, and it'll ping and labor knock, and people will start using premium gas, and that premium gas will actually burns a little slower than regular gas, and it's not as prone to ping, but it also, since it burns slower, it leaves some stuff behind, and it adds to the carbon and makes it worse and worse, and after a while, you'll get the carbon where it's really so bad that it just sounds like a really bad engine knock all the time. Somebody that's heard a lot of that can pick it out. And so what we would do is get some Type F transmission fluid and pour it down through the carburetor or the intake or whatever, revving it up. Leave the building like Elvis when you do this, because it's going to smoke a lot of smoke. And you pour some Type F transmission fluid. Does not have silicone in it, won't damage the oxygen sensors. And you keep pouring that down through there, revving it up and keeping the engine alive. Don't let the engine die while you're pouring it. And that softens that carbon and starts to work on getting it off there. Then you shut it down, you let the carbon soak with that wetness for a little while. Sometimes if you do it extremely, you may wet the plugs a little bit, but I always just crank it right back up, and then I follow up with cold water. You pour water down there, and it sputters and pops and carries on and cuts up and all that kind of thing. And it just cleans the stuffings out of them pistons, makes them just as clean as a whistle. I have known of, before they put catalytic converters on there, some of the older mechanics would pour rice down there. And that rice would sort of sand off those pistons. And you'd see Rice Krispies coming out of the exhaust pipe back there. I mean, there's all kinds of crazy stuff people do, trying to. But the long and the short of it was you can decarbonize one doing that, and they make some stuff that you can decarbonize with. But Type F transmission fluid, it doesn't cost much. There's no silicone in Type F transmission fluid, so it's not going to mess up your oxygen sensors, okay? Oxygen sensors are sensitive to being fouled by silicone, so be aware of that if you're pouring anything or spraying anything around them or whatever. Okay.
Seafoam?
Huh?
Seafoam?
Seafoam is okay. That's not bad. Seafoam's kind of expensive, but I like it. And I use, Seafoam. If you ever see that little blurb in there on Seafoam, it's really cool because they say, use it for everything. Pour it here, or pour it there, or do this. Wash your thing, drink, put it in your coffee. Everything. No, you don't put Seafoam in your coffee. But almost, by the time that guy's through talking, you think he's going to tell you to do that because all these Seafoam products, you just, the bug wash, you wash your carpet, wash your truck, wash your windshield, do this. Look, it's a helicopter. Huh? I don't think I'd put any in there. For what reason would you do that? You use brake booster dirty or what? I'm sure you did.
Carburetor.
They'll run you off. Okay, so this particular piston had a thin layer of carbon on it. It was identical to the other ones, and the head looked just as normal, but the crown of the piston was, whenever you ran it, whenever you turn the crankshaft, it stops a quarter of an inch lower at top dead center than all the rest of them. And it wasn't until the piston was pulled out of the engine that the bent rod was able, you can see the picture of it there on the thing. And there was no evidence of coolant leakage. The present owner never noticed any noise. Now, what about, let me ask you this. What are 3 things that can cause a partial misfire?
Coil pack?
Well, a partial misfire would be a misfire that's not all the time. Not a dead miss. Not a total misfire. Huh?
Dirt or incorrectly gapped spark plug?
Yeah, if a spark plug is gapped too close, you know, a lot of times whenever it's sitting there idling, you'll hear it going poo, 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 poo. That's a partial misfire. It's not hitting on every cylinder every time. Yeah, if you got contaminated fuel, it can do that. If you've got worn out spark plugs or partially fouled spark plugs, it can cause that.
What about like...
If you've got an injector that's partially clogged, huh?
That's what I was about to say, like a partially clogged.
Or right there at the intake runner where it goes into the cylinder, if you've got an air leak. It's a small air leak there, it can actually lean the mixture out on that particular one right there. Something else that can cause it is a slightly burned valve that's not burned bad enough to, you know, cause big problems, but it's bad enough to where it can pull air in there, that, you know, instead of valves.
Is that a pitted valve?
Yeah, it would be, well, the face of the valve where it's supposed to seat is actually going to be pitted or burned or whatever, yeah. Why would changing the window of piston travel change compression? And I mean, your piston used to go up and down here, and now it's going up and down a little lower.
It doesn't complete the pressure show.
Yeah, there's basically
all the air.
there's more, when it comes to the top of its travel, there's more room in the combustion chamber. Huh? I mean, the compression ratio, has it changed?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. Think about it. When you're at the bottom.
It's not going all the way up.
Yeah, I mean, it's not.
Hence the loss of power.
Yeah, if,
No,
how much space is there?
The compression
Hey, Zach, shut up. Just shut up. Just stop talking. Stop it. You're sitting over there. It's irritating as all get out when somebody's trying to do that. Now, this particular thing that I'm talking about, how close is a diesel piston to the head? When it comes to the top of its travel, how close? A diesel now, I'm talking about a diesel. 40 thousandths of an inch. That's really, really close. And this engineer up there that I was talking to that working on 6-liter diesels, he was actually saying that whenever they get good and hot, some of those things actually touch the cylinder head a little bit. He's actually seen marks on them. And that was an engineer that works in the engine lab up there at, you know, Power Stroke Diesel Factory that I was talking to. My technical editor was ticked off because he'd been wanting somebody like that to talk to her for a while. I just happened to sit down next to him in the hospitality booth. But anyway, what does the head of the piston look like if it's been ingesting a lot of coolant? It's going to be pretty and clean and all that kind of stuff. All right, now let's move on here and talk about hydraulic valve lifters. So basically, we had a bent rod because of an old, you know, water ingestion event, and he put a rod in there and cleared up that problem. I will tell you this. If you weren't driving something that was OBD2 that was storing these trouble codes, you would probably never know that rod was bent. Because he couldn't, the guy that was driving it couldn't feel it. The only thing that he had was a check engine light. Okay, now let's talk about hydraulic valve lifters. Okay, any of you guys ever work with anything that did not have hydraulic valve lifters? What can you think of that's a fairly common engine that does not have hydraulic valve lifters? What about a Briggs & Stratton lawnmower engine? It's got a plain old solid valve lifter. Hydraulic valve lifters in the handout here, I'm basically hitting the highlights here. 1930s they developed them, and they use pretty much the same design today. And they basically are calling it's called a hydraulic lash adjuster. You know what Jock had put in this article here, and it basically, if you've ever anybody ever tinker with a Volkswagen Beetle, not the new one but the older one?
That one that's air cooled?
Yeah. Now, valves have got to be adjusted on that thing ever so often because they're...
It's like just crank it up and literally snap it on there.
Well, the valve cover on the side of the block, you pull it off, and you got to put the engine in the right position, and you adjust the valves with a feeler gauge. You got a, you know, a little screw lash thing that touches the head of the valve, and then it's got a nut that locks it. And you basically adjust those valves so that the feeler gauge just drags. And every so often, because of the wear, the valve spring is going to cause it to beat into its stellite seat and all that, and there's other things going on. They'll stretch a little bit. It's got to be readjusted. The hydraulic ones have basically, you squish, I mean, you're part way down in that hydraulic, like whenever you were, Heinz, you were doing this morning, you were adjusting those valves, you might notice you were basically, when you turned it down, you were, if you could see that that valve lifter down there, you might notice that the push rod was shoving that little convex cup into the valve, into the lifter a little bit. And there's oil that's pumped into there. That oil gallery goes through there, keeps those full of oil. And there's a little drawing on the back, gives you an idea. Okay, you're supposed to measure lash with the engine cold, and the clearance is the greatest because stuff's going to expand with temperature. But the solid lifter engines are kind of noisy. Some of the old 2.8 liter Fords that had the carburetor on, they used to be solid lifter engines, and they always had a little clicking noise to them. But the lash is inside the lifter body. When you hear valve lash, think about the clearance that there is between that. You remember when we were talking about on the backlash on the gears? That's the clearance you're measuring with that dial indicator. The lash on the valves is not measured with a dial indicator. You're basically measuring the clearance between the rocker arm and the valve. So whether it's got variable displacement lifters or normal, hydraulic lash adjusters, oil is the components that makes it work. You got to put the right quality of oil in there. Let me ask you: have you ever heard what an engine sounds like whenever it starts to run low on oil?
Mine does it all the time. That's little.
Clickety clickety click, clickety clickety click. Right? You make that's what you, and that's the first thing that begins to starve for oil is the lifter gallery. I mean, that's up there at the top.
That's how I know when to put oil in my car when I hear that noise.
The way they pipe those things, the most important load-bearing components, your cam and your crankshaft, or your crankshaft particularly, it's going to get the oil first. And if there's if there's not as much oil, or if there's something going on, then the camshaft and the lifters are what's going to begin to starve before anything else does.
Okay, so the valve lash, you're measuring rocker arms?
How much space there is between the tip of the rocker arm and the tip of the valve?
That's for like oil in mine, like 2 weeks.
Yeah, like at its base, you got your rocker arm like this. All right, and basically there's on the V8, you got your push rod here, which is going to go down there, and then you got your valve here with its spring, and all that. So if you were measuring the distance, here is your valve lash. That little bit of distance between here and here. Now there's not any distance between here and here. If down here you got a hydraulic valve adjuster, which is be your little hydraulic lifter, and it's basically keeping that closed up all the time, so it's always quiet. Never makes a noise if it's set up right. On that Chevrolet, like Heinz was working on, if it's not set right though, you'll hear those Chevrolet lifters going clackety clackety clack too. I was telling him we have seen people that would buy a long block from like a parts house or somewhere. They bring it in here and it wasn't running right. And the first thing we do is pop the valve covers off and make sure the valves are adjusted right. You can also adjust them dynamically with the engine running, and most every redneck mechanic in the South has done that. You got a valve cover you cut the top out of, you pop it on there, and you loosen the valves until they go clickety clickety click, and then you tighten them up. When they stop, you go another half a turn. That's basically, and you go from valve to valve until you get them all done. And you can get them to where they're right. You basically are wanting to take all that lash out of there. So you got your hollow lifter body, which is like a little bucket. It's got a plunger, a spring-loaded check valve, and a main spring that keeps the plunger in contact with a push rod, the rocker arm, or the valve stem, whichever. Now some of these, like that Escort that you pulled apart this morning, Charles, did you notice that the lifters were in the head and the camshaft was also on the head? There was no push rods. The lifters were right in direct contact. They were hydraulic lifters. They were in direct contact. And on the Chryslers and most of the Fords, you basically just tighten down the valve train to the rocker arms. There's no adjustment at all, period. Now on some of the older Fords that you were supposed to, had various different length of push rods you were supposed to put in there to give you the right amount of lash, but I don't know if anybody ever fooled with that. They'd always put them together and they were close enough. But on the Chevrolet and on the V6, on the straight six Fords, you had to adjust them like you did on like Heinz was doing on the Chevrolet this morning. When the cam load starts to move the lifter, the pressure builds in the chamber under the plunger, and a little bit of oil is pumped out of the pressure chamber, and then the check valve closes, and the rest of the oil is trapped, and that pushes the plunger, and so it moves with the lifter body and opens the valve. Okay, so the lifter body goes near the bottom of the cam lobe, the pressure chamber drops because there's a little bit of oil pumped out on the upstroke, and the plunger can telescope down into the lifter body, and it lets the engine valve close completely. So the check valve opens and closes, and it basically has got oil leaving and coming in there, each time there's a cycle. Well, there's two different check valve designs. All right? Most of them use a spring-load ball, but lifters of higher performance engines use a thin disc instead of a ball to reduce reciprocating mass. Now then, let's see. Let me see. Number 2. Why do high-performance engine lifters use a thin disc instead of a ball? What did I just say? To reduce reciprocating mass. They're basically trying to keep, if everything is moving in and out really quick and all, it's going to slow things down if you got more weight there.
What was number 1?
Number 1, we haven't done that one yet. We started on number 2.
Number 2 was reduce what?
Reduce reciprocating mass. Reciprocating means going back and forth. And they don't want as much weight there, so they use a little disc instead of a ball. Every little bit that they can do helps. Okay, General Motors' displacement on demand engine and Chrysler's multi-displacement system uses the hydraulic lifters, but it fits into an extended outer housing. It rides on the cam lobe, and a retainer spring holds a hydraulic lash adjuster against the top of the housing between the spring and the locking pins, and the pins are spring-loaded. They fit into holes in the wall of the outer housing, and they lock it in place. And the hydraulic lash adjuster operates the valve normally in that configuration. So there's a separate oil galley in the engine that blocks, aligns with the pins, and whenever the control valve is open, oil pressure increases in the galley, pushes the pins out of the holes and into the interior of housing. And now, what you've done there, let me explain that in a way that's easier to understand. You've closed all the valves, you've trapped some exhaust gas in there, and the exhaust gas that's trapped in the cylinder where the valve's not opening is like a spring. Boing, 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 boing. Does your truck do that? Yeah, because you got nearly a new truck. I didn't know if they had that on it or not. But anyway, so basically they use the springs and they use the pin and all that, and it basically gives them the ability to shut off some of the cylinders in order to... Huh? Now, the other ones, the Fords, have you ever guys seen on the side of these Ford trucks it says Triton?
Yeah.
You know what that means? Most people don't know what it means. What that means is if you've got cylinder head, it's got cylinder head sensors that get, temperature sensors, and if, let's say, the truck runs out of water, and it gets so hot that it's going to damage something, so what that Ford does is it stops putting fuel and spark into like every other cylinder, and it does nothing except pump air with those cylinders, and it keeps it cool. And if it gets control of the cylinder head temperature that way, and if it needs to, it'll swap holes. It'll start firing these and stop firing other ones. And it basically prevents the engine from destroying itself if it runs out of water. Pretty cool. That's what the Triton does. Yeah, it's cool as all get out. They started doing it in 1997. Most people don't know anything about it. But if it's got cylinder head temperature sensors on it, it's got that. And it'll actually throw you a code telling it it has done that. You remember we had this...
So I heard, alright, so if it's under a load, I mean, of course, it's going to...
It's not going to feel the same when it's trying to overheat. It's saving itself, and it's getting you to where you're going. It's not going to put you down the side of the road, and it's not going to destroy itself. It's going to cool itself off by using some cylinders as air pumps. See, it's still operating the valves. Now, on the Chevy, they close the valves, and they trap some of the exhaust gas and use it for a spring to help boing, boing, boing the piston and all that kind of stuff. Okay, so they also shut off fuel to those cylinders, too, for obvious reasons, GM and Chrysler use that technology on their V8 engines to shut off 4 cylinders under light load conditions. Cadillac tried that for a while on 468 back in the 80s and 90s, whatever it was, and it didn't really work that well, but GM pretty well got their act together on that. Chrysler uses it too. Cylinder switching is a seamless thing. So the driver doesn't feel it. On the Ford, if it's trying to overheat, you'll get a check engine light. It's going to tell you that it had to save itself and all that. We had one the other day that them stupid heater, them quick connect heater cores wouldn't fit on that Chinese heater core right, and we pushed them on there. I would have swore it was on there good, but it heated up a little bit and blew it off, and the guy come in and he says, well, this thing got really hot, and I said, yeah, it's all right. It says Triton on the side, don't worry about it. Whether it's got variable displacement lifters or normal hydraulic lash adjusters, the oil makes it work. So you got to get the right good oil in there, and particularly on these engines that like those that have that system I was just talking about, they got to have the right kind of oil in them. And like the 3-valve Fords and all that, they need to make sure you put the right kind of oil in those, right weight and everything. Only a little bit of oil circulates through a lifter, and they got to be clean to prevent deposits that can clog the check valve. Hydraulic lifters are being adopted for use in smaller engines like motorcycles and lawn tractors. Why? Because they require no maintenance. That's answer to question number 1. If the oil's viscosity is too high, it won't flow through the check valve fast enough, and the lifter stays pumped up when the engine valve is supposed to be closed. Occasionally, you'll have a lifter that stays pumped up and won't, you know, work right when you're putting an engine back together and you didn't replace the lifters, then you'll have one that either have one that's clicking because it won't pump up, or you'll have one that's holding a valve open because it's pumped up. Those are the ones that's not adjustable. Okay, let's look at number 3. Oil pressure is pumped into the bottom of the lifter, and the body of the lifter. Why doesn't this pressure open the valve? Because oil pressure is lower than valve spring pressure. Got it? Oil pressure is lower than valve spring pressure. The valve spring is pretty strong. Number 4, define valve lash, the amount of looseness in the valve train. Number 5, what is the purpose of GM's DOD and Chrysler's MDS valve lifter systems?
Said to shut off 4 cylinders.
I'm on number 3.
I don't know, like those.
Yeah.
Very small boys get really slow sometimes.
No, we can't write that down.
Okay.
Okay, alright, I'm still on number 3 here.
That's what I'm saying.
Oil pressure is lower than valve spring pressure. That's why it doesn't, when you pumps oil in there, it doesn't open the valve.
To shut off 4 cylinders on the light.
See, because that push rod
Now it's gonna.
is part way down. I mean, he's got that plunger pushed part way down. Answer to number 5, fuel savings. If you shut off half the cylinders, you know, you don't burn as much gas. Yeah, and like I say, it's seamless. If you need the power, you get it right back.
That's what he said before.
Higher than called for viscosity oil takes longer to fill the lifter gallery. That would be number 6. Bessie May complains her engine makes a clattering noise for about a minute right after she starts it on a cold winter day. Further, she says she didn't do that until her brother Billy Bob changed her engine oil. The dipstick reads full. So he used oil that was a little too thick, see?
Oh, you use thick oil?
He used oil that was too heavy viscosity on her particular car. That didn't work. Older cars, it ain't that big of a deal. Newer cars is more of a problem. When should the valves be adjusted on an engine with solid lifters? When the engine's cold and the lash is the greatest. And finally, what does the hollow lifter body contain on a hydraulic valve lifter?
Plunger and a spring with a check valve.
And a main spring that keeps the plunger in contact with a push rod, rocker arm, or valve stem. It's got the hollow lifter body contains a spring-loaded check valve, a main spring that keeps the plunger in contact with the push rod, actually, all you need to put is a plunger, a spring-loaded check valve, and a main spring. Don't put that other stuff I said, because that was basically, that was number 8.
I try to do that on a cold winter day. Makes that really loud noise, but a little bit, and goes away.
You should try it with a warm winter day.
On a warm winter day, to do that.
Yeah.
Wait a minute. A warm winter day.
Shut off 4 cylinders on the light load.
I feel safe.
It actually saves gas. Yeah, it saves gas. Now we're going to talk about coolant. Okay, now, when customers come in for a coolant system flush and a fill of fresh antifreeze, you're supposed to have the right kind of coolant, right? What do you think? Huh? The 2 primary ones are ethylene glycol and propylene glycol. Aluminum engine components has caused a lot of reformulation of antifreezes, and there's also a lot of disagreement among domestic and some European car manufacturers on what coolant should be used. Okay, the questions all started with Rabbit and Sirocco when VW started making those a long time ago in the water-cooled engine lineup. VW put out a ban on antifreeze containing phosphate, and the bias was reportedly based on laboratory tests of different antifreezes, right? That's what I was talking about here. The phosphate, which was supposed to be a corrosion inhibitor, would drop out of the antifreeze water solution in hard water. Hard water is what?
Stagnant water?
Water with a lot of minerals in it. Yeah, water with a lot of minerals in it, that's hard water.
That's what some stagnant water is.
Yeah, stagnant water is just water standing still. We got usually has green scum on the top of it. All right, so VW owners heard that all American antifreezes, including Prestone 2, had phosphate in them. So a lot of them ended up with the VW dealer paying $11 a gallon for Autobahn brand antifreeze, and that's when everybody else was paying like $3 or $4 a gallon. Now the antifreeze is up to around $11, $12, $15 a gallon, 19, 18. But in 1978, Chrysler produced this little Omni and Horizon. They had Volkswagen engines in them, and they recommended Prestone 2. And so the antifreeze producer said, hey, it's been effective in preventing corrosion in the aluminum head. Have you ever looked in a water jacket in a car and seen how all that chalky garbage in there and rust and everything, even on aluminum, you know, that chalky stuff? I know this one guy that sells really nice late model used cars, and you know, when you open a hood on a car that's got aluminum parts visible, sometimes you'll see chalky stuff on the outside of the aluminum parts.
Yeah.
If he goes to a car sale and he's gonna buy a car, and he opens the hood and he sees any of that chalky stuff on the aluminum, he closes the hood and moves on to the next car. He will not buy one that's got that chalky stuff on the outside, because if it's got chalky stuff on the outside, it's probably a lot worse where you can't see it. You see, he wants something that doesn't have that. Pretty smart guy. Autobahn antifreeze is not the one that they used in Germany. It's not as effective in preventing aluminum corrosion. It would hold the corrosion particles in the solution so they don't cause radiator plug. What does that mean? It suspends the particles. They just stay floating, right? Like that. So Union Carbide added its own explanation. Some phosphate drops out in hard water, but the problem not real world. A phosphate in combination with other inhibitors is the best formula to prevent cavitation of erosion in aluminum water pumps. Cavitation erosion is the forceful collapse of coolant bubbles against the inside of the water pump, and it's great enough to cause chipping off of particles of aluminum. And what happens if you cavitate? The little impeller blade that wheels past there will not be as efficient, and you'll wind up with a water pump that doesn't pump as well. I actually put a water pump on a car one time back in 1984, and the guy, it was a little Plymouth Valari. He had it at Lincoln Mercury place. He worked business office guy, and he pulled it back in there, and you know, he was used to the temperature gauge running down about just above the, you know, bottom mark on the temperature gauge. And after I did it, he said it was running up in the middle, which is fine with me. I mean, it wasn't a big deal, but he didn't want that. No, I don't like that the way it was before. So I pulled the water pump back off, and I saw that the impeller, when the remanufacturer built it, he hadn't pressed it as far on there. And I measured it with my feeler gauge, and it was like 60 thousandths of an inch between the impeller and the reaction surface on that water pump. And the second water pump they sent me, it was only about 20 thousandths. And I put it on there, and it ran a lot cooler. So the closeness of that impeller to that reaction surface is going to have a lot to do with how well that thing pumps water. GM has used aluminum water pumps for a long time, and the performance standards for aftermarket antifreeze have always taken cavitation erosion into account. They don't want that to happen. So Ford introduced the Escort, published test procedures and standards to cover both aluminum head and aluminum water pump, and they included a 1,000-hour test. Now, I will tell you this, sometimes they do really extensive, long tests, like on the Chevrolet Vega. This friend of mine said one time that they had to tool up, redesign to build something, that aluminum block engine. They tested it rigorously in the laboratory, and it fell apart in the end, you know. The Vega was a cute little car, but that engine was junk. The antifreeze makers knew GM would have an aluminum head diesel for 82, so they went on. They could meet Ford and GM standards only with an antifreeze that had phosphate and silicates. Silicate is an established inhibitor of aluminum corrosion, but tends to gel as an ingredient in antifreeze. Anybody ever mix any antifreeze, have 50-50, and just leave it sitting up on your shelf in your garage for a while? I mean, just so you'll have some.
What'd you say on 5?
What's that now? All right, keep going. All right. Are we getting there? Anyway, what I started to say was, if you mix some up, if you're going to mix antifreeze and you want it to last a long time, you don't want to pull it off the shelf and find out it's turned to mush, because sometimes it will if you leave it there long enough. Use distilled water instead of tap water. Yeah. I mean, distilled water is what you're supposed to use. It doesn't cost very much. You can get a gallon of distilled water for 89 cents. You know, it's smarter if you're going to fill up your cooling system and it lasts a long time to use distilled water. Also, make sure you got a good radiator cap so that you're trapping everything. There's no air coming in and going. Oxidation causes big trouble in the cooling system. But anyway, so let me see. The quick move by American antifreeze manufacturers to formulation to provide good protection against aluminum corrosion forestall the problem. There's not a lot of radiators being plugged by aluminum particles being transferred from cylinder yet. You know, a lot of the times the engineers will come up with stuff they think is going to be a problem. It turns out not to be. Like one example is on fuel injection system, they put a doggone vacuum line going to that fuel pressure regulator because it changed the pressure. You know, like you give it the throttle, the pressure change in the intake, and they're thinking that it needed to remain constant, so they're going to change the fuel pressure so that it would always be balanced between what was in the intake. Now, turned out that really wasn't a very big deal. You know, somebody could take that vacuum line off and put a BB in it and put it back on there, and the thing would run just as good and wouldn't give any fuel problems or anything. So it was a problem that older vehicles, you got the, in your truck, I believe, it's got a brass and copper radiator. It's a radiator made of copper and brass.
Oh, the radiator.
Yeah.
I thought you said radio.
Yeah, radiator, yeah.
Yeah, well,
It shows up as
I had to change it out.
and this little, they use their own kind of solder. It shows up as a white deposit that can bloom over the tops of the radiator tubes and block them. That's basically that. The ones that we have now, the radiators are plastic and aluminum. And plastic and aluminum radiators, the bad thing about those is they like to split when they get old. And when they split, a lot of times they do it without warning, they burn your motor up. You have 120,000 miles on the car?
The old one was straight original. It was like all metal and it was heavy.
Yeah.
Really didn't even have that.
Yeah.
But it broke.
Did you replace it with a plastic and aluminum or something?
Yeah.
Yeah, the one that I put on my 80 model Ford Pucket I used to drive, it actually was still brass and aluminum. I mean, I don't remember, I got it from Sam or somebody. But the ultrasonic cleaner, people used to clean radiators a lot, but they don't do that anymore much, you know. I mean, there used to be a radiator shop in Enterprise that cleaned radiators and fixed starters and alternators. And those same people still fix starters and alternators, but they don't clean radiators anymore. So that's pretty much gone. These crimped together and epoxy sealed aluminum radiators don't have the solder bloom problem, but high mileage vehicles over 100,000 miles, if the plastic tank splits on an aluminum plastic radiator, you can lose an engine at warp speed. Seen it happen. Cadillac sitting beside the road out there on the interstate with an old man and his wife. We stopped there to give him a hand, opened up the radiator, split all the way down the side, just cooked that Cadillac engine, and it was totally boat weight material after that. Not a bad idea to sell a radiator on high mileage vehicles. They don't cost much these days. You know what I mean? I mean, what I would probably tell the customer if I was writing service, I'd say, you know, your car's got a lot of miles on it, you're looking at 150,000, probably not a bad idea to drop a radiator in there. They don't cost much. Don't cost a lot to change one in most cars. Some of them. If it splits, that's right. The belt tensioner or something else. The belt tensioner can fail without warning. I've had it happen on the car I was driving. You got a belt tensioner you think is fine, that spring-loaded belt tensioner, and they'll just pop all of a sudden. What happens when your belt tensioner pops? You lose your power steering, you lose your alternator, you lose your water pump usually, and you're, you know, over beside the road and you're dead in the water. I mean, this is tow truck material, unless you walk to a parts house. You know what I mean? So you keep an eye on that too. All right, now 7-point checklist published by the National Automotive Radiator Service Association. 1. Radiator pressure cap test to check the preventative system pressure level. I ain't worried about testing the radiator cap. I'm gonna look at it. If I don't like what I see, I'm gonna throw it away and put one on it. If it's old and I'm doing a coolant system flush, I'm probably gonna put one on it anyway. They'll cost $5-6 bucks. Thermostat check for proper opening and closing. How do you do that? How do you do it? How do you check to see if the thermostat's opening and closing right?
Well, you could take it out and heat it up and watch it.
You could. That's not always.
Hot water in there.
Doing the same.
We're basically, well, right now I'm just asking questions. We're gonna go through we're gonna blow through these 8 questions in a minute, and I'm gonna give you the answers to them. But right now I'm asking you other questions. I mean, if somebody says, I want to know if my thermostat's open and closing, I'm gonna plug my scan tool in. I'm gonna warm this thing up, and I'm gonna watch how high the coolant temperature goes. And if I see it hit about 210, and then it drops down to about 195, then it goes back to 210, and it goes back to 195, and the thermostat's working.
But on older models, you can't really do that.
You can't, not if you can't, but basically you can measure it with your temperature gun.
Oh.
You got a temperature gun, you can shoot the thermostat housing, you know, so you can do it that way. You can basically tell. If you better get a thing. And one of the things that worries me about some of the people when I'm teaching, what they'll do is when I'll say, okay, fill up the cooling system and make sure that it's full and all that kind of stuff. And next thing you know, I see them putting the radiator in, and I look up 10 minutes later and they're back in the truck out of the shop. They didn't check that thing, it's probably not full. And I've actually had some of the trainer vehicles, after these exercises, overheat because the person that worked on it was in a hurry to get it out of the shop, didn't make sure it was full. Coolant. Thermostat's got to be open, and you got to make sure the air is burped out of the block, everything's going. Turn on the heater, make sure the heater's warm, because if the heater core is not getting any water through it, you're low on coolant. It's really, really important to do that. Yeah, huh? All that stuff, the hose coming from the thermostat.
Yeah.
Make sure you know where the thermostat is. Sometimes the thermostat's in the bottom hose.
Hey, what if you leave one of the hoses off?
It's going to cause all kinds of issues. It's going to.
What if you leave the?
You're not cycling.
Well, my mom, when her ex-husband put her radiator back in, he didn't put one of the hoses back on. She just looked out the car. I don't know what hose it was. She said her heater doesn't work anymore.
Well, that was probably something he may have bypassed the heater core or something. Pressure test to identify external leaks to the coolant system parts, including the radiator, water pump, engine coolant passages, radiator, heater hose, and heater core. Most of these V8s and V6s have got a water passage. You know, the water passage going through the intake manifold. Be aware of that. Plastic intakes can leak. I'll know that. That Crown Victoria, one of the Crown Victorias sprung up intake leak. The intake split without warning on that high mileage Crown Victoria over there, and they had to put an intake manifold on it. Some shop over in Andalusia did it. And I think they charged them $1,000 to change that intake manifold. Pretty big money there. which that was, you know, labor, time, and all that. I mean, it's probably fair. An internal leak test to check for combustion gas leakage into the coolant system. Whoa, what about that? Internal leakage test. If you got combustion leaking into the coolant system, what you going to have? Going to make it overheat, isn't it? Because that's hot. Heats up the coolant.
Oh, yeah.
You're going to see that stuff bubbling out of the radiator, and it stinks. It's got a sickly sweet smell. It's just different. Once you smell it, you won't forget it. Something else you can do, fire it up, let it run about 60 seconds, switch it off. I mean, this is when it's been setting all night. Let it run about 60 seconds. No, switch it off, take the radiator cap off, and if there's pressure in the radiator, you know you got a head gasket leak. You shouldn't build pressure in a radiator just running 60 seconds.
So if you have pressure in your...
If you got pressure in there after running 60 seconds after all that cold soak, you know you got some, you know, compression gas.
Do you do that with every vehicle or just...
Most every vehicle I've ever seen. And like I say, if you run it like a minute to 90 seconds, just get one that you know is okay, and crank it, let it run for a minute and 90 seconds, take the cap off and see what you see. You know, you don't see any pressure that way. You will after the coolant starts to heat up, but it's not going to heat up enough in 60 seconds, 60 to 90 seconds. And a lot of these little foreign cars we used to work on were like that. We'd see them do that. We'd see them puff into there like that, but I've done it on American cars too. Let's see, visual inspection of coolant system components, belts, and hoses. We had one Toyota Camry that came out here, and the hose got so rotten that whenever it blew out, there was a chunk of the hose about that much missing in action, just gone. And also there was a swelled up hose that looked like it was just about to bust on that Pontiac one day while I was working on it. And I happened to notice that. I was like, oh, you know, that would have been third-degree burns if that thing had busted and sprayed water on me. System power flush and refill with the car's recommended coolant, and test engine fan for operation. Now, Motorcraft Premium Gold engine coolant is yellow, and that distinguishes it from the other coolants, which are premium coolant green and orange specialty coolant. My car uses that, and my pickup uses that, but they put a bittering agent in it. Now, here's one of your questions, guys. They put a bittering agent to make it taste bad, so if you can identify it as something you're not supposed to put in your mouth. So you can identify it as a non-edible substance if you accidentally ingest it.
For animals as well.
Yeah, there you go. Ford started adding it to the U.S. in response to laws that require it be added to prevent poisoning and death in people that mistake the liquid for a beverage. And it's like a 50% coolant, 50% still water. Okay, let's whip through this. We got just a very minute or two left here. And let's see what we can do about getting our questions answered here. What type of radiators are assembled with solder? Yeah, the copper and brass ones, right. Why do many coolants contain phosphate?
Prevent cavitation erosion.
Yeah, it's corrosion. It's a corrosion inhibitor. How does aluminum corrosion in the cylinder heads cause radiator problems?
It causes cavitation erosion?
No, it actually makes aluminum particles can deposit in the radiator tubes. And there's something else I wanted to say before I got out of here. The ethylene glycol is pretty doggone poison stuff. Propylene glycol, and one of the reasons they went to that in that orange coolant, it's not as poison.
Yeah, I've seen what you're talking about. You said on food, that whole...
Yeah, Mio stuff, yeah.
Yeah, that's not... There's a couple other things I've seen on Walmart and I was walking through and I seen they have a lot of
propylene.
Products.
Yeah, propylene glycol is a sweetener that they put in a lot of food and stuff. And if you look it up on the internet, it doesn't really hurt anything. Now, I'm not going to tell you that you can drink orange antifreeze, okay? Because there's a lot of other crap in there that will kill you, you know. So don't go drinking orange antifreeze. But if you see something on your food stuff, like if you buy it, like that Mio stuff you mix with your water, you know, then it's not a big deal. I mean, they're not trying to kill you, okay? Cavitation erosion, everybody knows what that is. What's an established inhibitor of aluminum corrosion but tends to gel as an ingredient? Who said? What about buffering and neutralization of acidic and sulfurous combustion gas byproducts? What does that? Borates. Okay, why is the bittering agent added? So they can make sure that you don't, if you eat it, if you put it in your mouth, you want to spit it out. And then finally, what is it that suppresses the formation of foam? Polyalcohol. Now, do you guys know stuff you didn't know before? Well, if you don't, you ought to. If you don't, it's your own fault. That's like when you leave Brazos, Brazil, and Enterprise, if you're hungry, it's your fault. But they'll keep feeding you until you're full.
I don't think I heard a word you said. You went,
That's because you were a slow listener.
I was listening clearly today. I couldn't even hear.